The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the fogged windows of the old oak pub, sounding like skeletal fingers scratching at century-old wood. The scent of aged craft beer mingled with damp oak, creating a thick atmosphere, the flavor of time I had nurtured for 5 years. I stood behind the bar, drying crystal grasses with a soft cloth under the dim yellow light, sensing the silence before the storm. The future 6 floors of the Vanguard building already seemed to weigh down on this ancient roof, though they only existed on greedy blueprints. The doorbell rang violently, cutting through the smooth jazz drifting through the room. The Ashford family marched in, bringing a chill and the scent of expensive perfume that masked the aroma of barley. Conrad, my father-in-law, led the way with a triumphant face he had perfected over decades of using people as pawns. Blythe walked beside him, her monogrammed handkerchief ready to dab away fake tears if necessary. Thomas, the golden child brother-in-law, entered and looked around with the contempt he reserved for things he called old junk. "Jack, stop wearing that pathetic face," Thomas said, his voice high and mocking as he tapped the oak counter. Conrad said nothing. He simply pulled a file from his expensive leather briefcase and tossed it onto the bar right in front of me. The document lay there, cold and ruthless, bearing the logo of the Vanguard Real Estate Group. "We have signed the contract to sell this entire plot," Conrad announced, his voice booming like a final, unappealable sentence. "This place will be demolished next month to build Charleston's most luxury apartment complex." I looked at the contract, feeling my heart begin to beat painfully in my chest. "You're fired immediately, Jack," Thomas added, his malicious grin widening. "No compensation, no severance, because you're just a lucky manager this family gave a job to so you wouldn't starve." Blythe dabbed at her face, her eyes not even glancing at me, as if I were a stain on the floor. I gripped the cloth in my hand, feeling the oak beneath my palm trembling in protest along with me. This injustice was no accident. It was a calculated attack to strip away everything I had built. The Ashford family stood there, confident in their wealth and power, completely unaware that I had prepared for this moment for a long time. The death sentence for the old oak they just signed was actually a bankruptcy sentence for themselves. I raised my head, forcing a smile I had filled with the ultimate hidden meanings. "Thank you for letting me know early," I said softly, my voice so calm it made Conrad pause for a beat.
Their time was running out, and the real hunt was just beginning.
"I am Jack, 32 years old, a man who spent 5 years of his youth reviving a dying legacy from the ashes of neglect. When I married Lydia, the eldest Ashford daughter, I believed in the promise of a family preserving Charleston's ancient values together. But the truth shattered quickly when I realized I was just a high-end servant, the one left to shoulder the consequences of this clan's mistakes.
For 5 years, I worked 16 hours a day, hands calloused from cleaning, and mind exhausted from perfecting craft beer recipes. The Ashford family looked at me as a lucky waiter, a gold digger who managed to slip into an old money family, whose name was on buildings and scholarship funds. Conrad and Blythe always valued the vanity of their son Thomas more than the real results I brought to the table.
Thomas could rack up tens of thousands of dollars in debt from his profligate lifestyle, and his father would always smile and sign the check. As for me, even after reviving the Old Oak's revenue by 300%, I only received a cold nod of approval. Lydia, my wife, whom I once thought was my only ally, gradually transformed under her family's pressure and manipulation. She began to look at me with pity, a kind of pity more painful than direct contempt. "You're just a manager, Jack. Stop acting like you own this land," she had said when I suggested repairing the ancient roof. It made me realize that deep down, she also viewed me as a replaceable ornament. About a year ago, noticing the greedy eyes of real estate corporations fixed on the pub's land, I began to act. I secretly contacted Adeline, a sharp lawyer with the eye of an expert who studied how people commit crimes. Adeline guided me in collecting every historical document, every original blueprint from the 18th century still gathering dust in the cellar. While the Ashfords were busy with tea parties and lavish trips, I secretly filed an application for stake historical landmark status. I spent hours photographing every architectural detail, every key joint of the oak walls, to ensure no loophole for demolition remained. The feeling of living a double life in my own home was a suffocating suppression. I had to nod in agreement with Conrad's unreasonable demands and swallow Thomas's insults just to keep the plan from leaking. The more I watched them sink into their arrogance, the clearer I saw the day of judgment approaching. They were predators feasting on a fake bait, completely unaware the true hunter was standing in the shadows. The Ashford family thought they could use Lydia to bind me, making me submissive and weak. But that version of Jack, the one who listened, died the night I realized Lydia had secretly signed the consent form for the land sale. I erased every trace of weakness, replacing it with the terrifying calm of a man who has nothing left to lose. Every line in that historical landmark file was a noose I had prepared for the Ashford Empire's throat. The gilded cage they had been so proud of for so long was beginning to crack from the inside, and I, Jack, would be the last one standing to witness it all turn to ash. The final days at the Old Oak passed in a threatening stillness, like the thick atmosphere before a massive storm hits Charleston. I watched men in cheap suits from the Vanguard group walking through the pub, carrying cold metal measuring tapes to record every centimeter of the legacy. The clacking sound of the tapes against the oak floor sounded sharp and insulting, as if they were measuring the dimensions for a giant coffin. They casually discussed demolishing the western brick wall,
which held the traces and memories of generations of regulars from the last century. The smell of dust and destruction began to overwhelm the familiar scent of barley, making my chest tighten in a professionally suppressed rage. Conrad appeared frequently in the mornings, bringing the scent of expensive cigars and a dictatorial urgency in every word.
He threw equipment handover forms onto the bar, forcing me to sign off that everything was in working order, so he could extract more compensation from the corporation. I only looked at the stack of papers with a vacant gaze, hands gripping the glass cloth, keeping my expression neutral and submissive. Lydia came to me late one afternoon as the sickly yellow sunset was dying over the dusty old wine bottles. She placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture I once considered affection, but now only felt a cold falseness gliding over the fabric. "Jack, do this for me. Just sign the papers, and we'll have a brilliant new future after leaving this old junk behind," she said in a sweet, calculating voice. Her words sounded like a perfectly staged melody, dripping with manufactured sweetness to manipulate my will. I looked deep into my wife's eyes, searching for even the smallest trace of remorse, but only saw the reflection of greed. Meanwhile, I secretly coordinated with Adeline, the sharp lawyer who observed everything with the eyes of a seasoned criminal expert. We met in the darkest corners of town, where jazz music and noise helped hide the plans to flip the board.
Adeline confirmed that my historical landmark file had reached the final appraisal stages and received absolute support from the Heritage Society. Each piece of information she provided was like a bullet loaded into a chamber, waiting for the precise moment to pull the trigger. Thomas didn't miss a single chance to humiliate me in front of the Vanguard representatives.
He mocked my old apron, saying I should get used to being a waiter in cheap roadside bars after this pub was leveled. He didn't know that his boundless arrogance and self-importance were the best catalysts for the plan I was running. I began packing the pub's mementos, black and white photos, corks signed from the early century. In reality, I was meticulously marking every irreplaceable architectural detail to supplement the state landmark file. The feeling of living two lives in the place I cared for most was exhausting, but the satisfaction of an approaching justice kept me alert. The phone in my pocket vibrated constantly. Encrypted messages from Adeline signaled that the legal noose was ready. I watched Conrad indulging in dreams of massive compensation from Vanguard and felt a deep pity for his stupidity. The regulars came to say goodbye in tears, touching the oak walls as if saying farewell to a loved one. They didn't know I was fighting a silent war to keep this home for all of us. The farewell party was approaching, and I knew it would be the most unforgettable night for the Ashford family and all of Charleston. The scent of deception from the in-laws was heavy, but it would soon be extinguished by the flavor of truth and justice. The gilded cage the Ashford clan had boasted of for so long was shaking violently against the steel evidence I held. I took a deep breath of the barley scent one last time before the real storm erupted, feeling stronger than ever. The farewell party for the old oak took place in a space that was brilliant, but filled with vanity and falsehood. Crystal chandeliers cast warm yellow light, reflecting on the expensive champagne glasses the Ashfords had generously prepared with the very money they were about to steal from me. The smell of high-end food mingled with luxury perfume, creating an atmosphere thick with arrogance.
I stood in a dark corner behind the bar, hands still slowly drying a crystal glass, eyes observing every movement of the Ashford dynasty, reveling in a fake aura. Conrad stood in the center of the room, his perfectly tailored suit hugging his fleshy frame, his face radiant as if he had just conquered the world.
Blythe stood beside him, constantly smiling and dabbing her powder with the familiar monogrammed handkerchief, acting like a noble lady bestowing her presents. Thomas was waving a wine glass, loudly discussing the apartment projects that would rise from the ashes of this pub. Lydia stood by her brother, wearing a stunning champagne-colored silk dress, but in my eyes she looked lost amidst the ruins of Betrayal. Honored guests. Conrad boomed, the sound amplified through the speakers, making the pub suddenly go silent. Today is not just a day to bid farewell to an old location, but the beginning of a new empire called Ashford Vanguard. He pulled out a gold pen, placing it on the final property transfer contract where the Vanguard representative waited with a satisfied smile. The moment the nib touched the paper, the pub's main door burst open. The sound of high heels clicking decisively on the oak floor rang out like hammer blows on Conrad's self-satisfaction. Adeline walked in, her powerful black suit and the gaze of an uncompromising lawyer making the space suddenly cold. Accompanying her were two middle-aged men wearing badges from the State Historical Landmark Commission. "Stop right there, Mr. Conrad."
Adeline's voice rang out, sharp and firm as a sentence handed down in court. The room held its breath. Conrad froze, the gold pen leaving a messy ink blot on the $1 million contract. "Who are you to cause a scene here?" Thomas shouted, his face red with rage and shame. Adeline didn't even look at him. She walked straight to the signing table and placed a file with a bright red government seal on it. "I am the legal counsel for Mr. Jack, and this is an order to stay all sale and demolition activities for the Old Oak. As of 4 p.m. today, this building has been officially recognized as a state historical landmark." A deathly silence enveloped the pub, so heavy one could hear a single drop of wine hit the floor. Conrad's face turned from a healthy flush to an ashen gray, his hands beginning to tremble. "You—"
"What have you done, Jack?" He growled at me like a cornered beast. I slowly set the glass down, removed my manager's apron, and stepped out from behind the bar with a confidence they had never seen. I only did what a true preservationist should do, Father, I said, my voice calm but filled with ultimate judgment. The old oak is not a pile of bricks for you to sell to cover Thomas's gambling debts. It is a legacy, and state law strictly prohibits any demolition or structural changes to these landmarks. The Vanguard representative immediately stood up, his face filled with horror and rage. Mr. Conrad, you guaranteed this land had no legal encumbrances. This is systematic fraud. Our corporation is withdrawing immediately and suing the Ashford family for gross breach of contract.
That declaration was like a nuclear bomb exploding in the pub, leveling Conrad's last hopes. Blythe fainted on the spot, her monogrammed handkerchief falling to the floor, trampled by the shoes of guests in the chaos. Thomas stood frozen, the wineglass in his hand falling and shattering into 1,000 sparkling crystal shards like his own future. Lydia rushed toward me, eyes filled with tears, hands clutching my arm like a drowning person. "Jack, you can't do this. You're my husband. We're family," she sobbed, trying to use the old tactic to manipulate me. I gently but firmly removed her hand, looking deep into those eyes filled with selfishness. Family never stabs each other in the back to sell their own soul, Lydia.
You chose to stand with deception, and now you must learn to live with the consequences. The submissive version of Jack, who always tried to please his in-laws at any cost, had died the moment she signed that sale agreement. The jazz music had died, replaced by the whispering gossip of high society guests hurrying out like rats fleeing a sinking ship.
Conrad sat slumped in a chair, the crumpled contract in his hand, his breathing becoming difficult under the weight of the collapse. The scent of ruin hung over the Ashford estate, but for me, it was the scent of purification. I looked at Adeline. She raised her glass slightly toward me, a discreet smile on her lips. Just served, and the legacy of the old oak would never be buried under soulless concrete blocks. I walked into the center of the pub, taking a deep breath of the air containing the 100-year-old oak scent. The monster of greed had been crushed by the very trap it created, and I, finally, was completely, truly free from this rotten, gilded cage. The next morning, the Charleston sun filtered through the old oak leaves, shining on the wooden floor that had been cleansed of the stains of greed. I stood in front of the pub, taking a deep breath of the salty sea air, feeling the sweetness of the independence I had long craved. The phone in my pocket vibrated constantly. Messages from Lydia and Conrad appeared like the final efforts of a dying monster. They begged for forgiveness. They spoke of family, of memories that were actually just a series of days. They eroded my self-respect to feed their arrogant egos. A year ago, the old version of Jack would have felt guilty, wondering if he was too cruel to push them to the edge. But that submissive Jack had completely vanished with Conrad's crumpled contract last night. I slowly pressed the block command for each number, feeling as if I were removing heavy chains that had been embedded in my skin for 5 long years. No more secret wire transfers to pay off Thomas's debts. No more enduring Blythe's insults in silence. Adeline walked toward me,
holding the results of a spectacular crowdfunding campaign from the pub's regulars.
They didn't just send money. They sent their trust to the only person who had truly cherished and protected the soul of this pub. With that capital, I officially bought back all business rights from the bank, liquidating the Ashford clan's collapsing assets. Conrad now has to learn to live in a cramped apartment in the suburbs, far from the bright lights of the high society he worshipped.
Thomas is facing federal investigations into financial fraud, and Lydia has disappeared into the shame of having stabbed her husband in the back. I know that some bridges, once burned, are best left as ashes forever. I stepped inside, the scent of oak and barley welcoming me like a true master, warm and sincere. The pub is now free from the burden of falsehood. It has become more vibrant, pure, and authentic than ever before.
I stood behind the bar, looking out at the Charleston harbor glowing under the dawn, and knew my true journey was just beginning. The monster of manipulation is gone. The gilded cage is open, and I am finally, completely, truly free.